Let's bring in Politico campaign reporter Kevin Robillard. He joins us from the Politico newsroom in Arlington, Virginia. So, Kevin, our John Dickerson told us earlier that this could just be a lawyer doing his due diligence in a heated political environment. Could that be the case here, or do you think that this request for legal protection is real cause for concern for the president and the administration?
I think what John said earlier is almost certainly true. This could just be a lawyer doing his best to protect his client. And look, if we go back to the campaign, a number of Hillary Clinton staffers asked for and were granted immunity to testify either to the House Benghazi Committee or to other committees or to the FBI, and none of them were ever charged with anything criminally. So this doesn't necessarily mean that Flynn did something criminal and is looking to make sure he doesn't get prosecuted for it. It really is just something lawyers try to negotiate on behalf of their clients, particularly if they think the client has testimony that either the prosecuting authorities or congressional committee might find valuable.
So here's what we know about Flynn so far, that he did meet with the Russian ambassador during the transition, that he did discuss sanctions to a certain degree. But what questions would you want answered by General Flynn about his contacts that he hasn't already addressed?
I think ultimately the biggest question is how much contact did he have with the Russians? How did the sort of pro-Russian stance that the Trump campaign took, how much was that influenced by figures like Flynn, like former campaign chairman Paul Manafort? How much was that influenced by the fact that Flynn took some money from Russia Today, which is Russia's English language news network? There's a lot of questions about just sort of how this web of ties between the Trump campaign and Russia actually fits together, and whether any of this was actually some sort of quid pro quo. That's the one thing that a lot of people, there's a lot of smoke here, but there's no fire directly proving that the Trump campaign somehow asked Russia for help or made some type of agreement with the Russian government. There's just no evidence indicating that, and there's a lot of evidence indicating that this just sort of all happened out in the open and was more of a happy coincidence for both sides than anything else.
All right, Kevin, we threw up the president's response earlier, calling the whole thing a, quote, witch hunt. Do you think that there are members of Congress who would agree with the president on that?
Oh, almost certainly. A good portion of the Republican caucus, at least publicly, would say that this is, overblown, and that Democrats are just looking for a way to delegitimize the president and hurt him politically.
But Kevin, it's General Flynn who's offering to give this testimony, which he thinks might be relevant to the investigation, and he's asking for immunity. It's not Democrats as John said earlier to us, the idea that the FBI would be somehow politicized is simply not true. So if Republicans are saying that it's a witch hunt, what does that mean?
It means that partisanship trumps everything else, which is, I think, very true, particularly in this particularly politically polarized era. I'm not saying that Republicans really have any justification to believe that. I'm just saying that that's at least what they're going to say publicly, because they don't want to pile on and hurt the president, because they need the president in power to, maybe take another crack at repealing Obamacare, to cut taxes, to do a lot of things they want to do. They need a politically powerful Republican president, and that's why they're holding off, and why you see people like Devin Nunes apparently running interference for the president. That's why you don't see hundreds of Republicans joining Democrats in calling for an investigation, even though the need for the investigation, I think everyone could agree, is pretty clear.
All right, so speaking of Devin Nunes, the latest bits of information we're getting, reports are out that the surveillance documents that he briefed the president on actually came from officials inside the White House. So what are the key questions that you have right now about how this all unfolded with Chairman Nunes?
I think the number one key question here is, was this all sort of a ruse just to get some veneer of legitimacy over the president's accusation that he hasn't presented any evidence for, that President Barack Obama wiretapped him? And that appears to be what it was. It appears to be that they found some type of way that they could make the president's statement at least partially true, because it's never going to be fully true, because the president can't just order a wiretap, which seemed to be what Trump was suggesting in his tweet, but to at least give it a veneer of legitimacy. And so I think whether or not the White House sort of worked with Nunes to make that all happen so that they basically gave Nunes information that he then apparently briefed the president on and told the press about as a way to give a veneer of legitimacy to what Trump says. I think that's really the question of how much that was the cause of all of this is the biggest question.
So it's so fascinating to me, Kevin. So if that is exactly what happened, in a way to sort of backtrack and say, look, the president put out this tweet, and look, here's some information. We're going to share that with the House Intel chair.
And justify that comment about him feeling somewhat vindicated.
But what is that? I mean, if you're Devin Nunes, I mean, it doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do.
Yeah, until you again go back to the fact that Devin Nunes was picked for this job by House Speaker Paul Ryan. It's a select committee. It's not a committee that he worked his way up through. He was put there by House leadership, and he's trying to work for House leadership. And he's trying, again, not to cripple a president that they want a lot of things from. They want Trump to be politically powerful so that they can take another shot at repealing Obamacare, so that they can pass tax cuts. What they've ultimately determined, to a certain extent, this is, most Republicans in Congress, is that that is more important than an investigation of Russia. And I think that, could explain a lot of what Nunes is doing. That might be a very cynical explanation for it, but it's the one that makes the most sense right now.
Okay, so before we let you go, Kevin, I gotta ask you about your take on the president's attacks on the Freedom Caucus. Yesterday, he tweeted out a bunch of things, and he was actually naming members personally in his tweets, threatening to fight them in the midterms. Look, the Republican Party, they have a lot of big challenges ahead of them. You mentioned taking another crack at Obamacare, tax reform, all sorts of big, meaty things. Intra-party fighting cannot be good.
No, it can't be. And every bit of political capital Trump expends attacking Jim Jordan from Ohio or Mark Meadows from North Carolina is political capital he can't spend pressuring Democrats in the Senate because they're going to need 60 votes on some of these things. Every time he takes a shot at Mark Meadows, it's a little bit of time, it's a little bit of energy that they can't use, pressuring Montana Senator Jon Tester, a Democrat, over tax reform in a few months. And so that's really what the problem here is. And the other thing is, the Freedom Caucus, these aren't people who are going to be intimidated by a president. Sort of the entire point of the Freedom Caucus is that they're the people who are willing to lose their seats over ideology. They are the furthest right group in the Republican conference, and they take a great deal of pride in that. And the fact that they have a president who many of them don't necessarily consider all that conservative to begin with, attacking them, really for them is going to be a point in pride. It's not going to work at flipping these people. And the other thing is, in many of their districts, they are personally more popular than Donald Trump.
That's what,
it's hard to see how Trump really exerts much influence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say, it appears that, if you look at the way it was during the primaries, where clearly his primary challengers were kind of afraid that Trump would take to Twitter and fire up people against them, it doesn't appear that these Freedom Caucus members are all that afraid of the president's tweets. And we've had people responding on Twitter. For example, Thomas Massey, he wrote, at Real Donald Trump, it's a swamp, not a hot tub. We both came here to drain it. Hashtag swamp care poll, 17%, sad. I mean, they're striking back on Twitter, too.
And there was another lawmaker out of Michigan, I think, who basically said you're acting like a child. Right. He basically said, listen, we're not going to be intimidated by bullies. And, this might have passed in 5th grade, but not now. That's not how you run a government.
Yeah, I think that reaction says a lot. Both Massey and Amash are two people in particular. Massey actually technically isn't a member of the Freedom Caucus because he just chosen not to join groups like that, I believe. But both Massey and Amash are both the kind of people who are, they're both libertarian leaning. They both believe in a very limited government. They both thought what Trump was proposing with, Ryan care or Trump care, whatever we want to call it, was just too much big government, too much Obamacare light, as they've called it. And they take a lot of pride in the fact that they're willing to say no, even when everyone else is willing to go along. That is sort of the reason they think they're here. The reason they think they're in Washington, D.C., is to stand up partially to other Republicans. So really what Trump is doing is only enhancing their own self-image. You know what I mean? It's not, intimidating them in the way it might a more mainstream Republican.
All right, Politico's Kevin Robillard, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Great to be on.